Okay, good afternoon. Thank you. And we are calling this meeting of the TRPA Governing Board to order. The date is Wednesday, February 22nd, 2023, and it is now 1:17 p.m. The first item on the agenda is the roll call to determine a quorum. Maria?
Miss Aldine? Here. Mr. DeCara?
Here.
Ms. Conrad Seda?
Here.
Ms. Dis?
Here.
Ms. Faustinos?
Here.
Mr. Bass? Mr. Bass, looks like you may be muted. I'll circle back. Ms. Gustafson?
Here.
Mr. Hicks?
Here.
Ms. Hill?
Here.
Mr. Honigman?
Here.
Ms. Lane?
Here.
Mr. Rice?
Here.
Mr. Settlemeyer?
Here.
Ms. Williamson?
Here.
Mr. Bass?
Here.
Hey, Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Maria. And the second item on the agenda is for me to go over all the rules today. So for members of the public who are joining us remotely, to observe the meeting, go to trpa.gov and under the calendar header, click on Governing Board Hybrid Meeting for February 22nd, 2023. There you'll find the link to the public webinar hosted on Zoom. To address board members directly with your comments, raise your hand in Zoom by clicking raise hand at the bottom of your screen at the appropriate agenda item. And with your hand raised, you will be unmuted by TRPA staff and have 3 minutes to address the board. If you have used the dial-in numbers to join us by telephone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand and be unmuted. To remote board members, if you wish to speak, please also raise your hand in Zoom. You will find the hand icon on the bottom of your screen. Remote board members may not use the chat box to make any comments or to have sidebar conversations. And please, everyone, remember to mute your mic unless speaking to cut down on background noise. And finally, I would like to ask that all remote members turn on their cameras if they are able. Members of the public who have joined us in person, thank you for being here. Please raise your hand at the appropriate time for public comment and you will be called to the front to speak. And board members who are in person, please raise your hand or get my attention if you'd like to speak. And please speak clearly into the microphone in front of you. If you are viewing the webinar on a personal computer, please ensure that the microphone and speakers are turned off to prevent audio feedback in the room. And with that, we will go to item 2 on our agenda, the Pledge of Allegiance. And Mr. Hicks, could I ask you to lead us in the pledge?
I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. We'll move on to item 3 on our agenda, and this is the approval of the agenda. Does staff have any changes to today's agenda?
No changes, Madam Chair.
Okay, then we'll ask, are there any objections from the board or changes requested? No one here in the room. Are there any members online that have any changes to the agenda?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
maybe this is not necessary, but we do have an errata sheet that was received, which adds an item under General Counsel Status Report on the Compact's open meeting law requirements. I believe that's a change to the agenda as originally posted.
It is, John?
Yes, but it's been posted, so
Mhm.
the change, so
Okay,
you can note that for clarity.
Okay.
but
it has been posted as such, and we'll just clarify that there was a change in that agenda item. Okay, then we'll deem the agenda is approved as posted and amended for the record. And then, thank you. I'd like to remind the board that we are still short a member from California as the appointment to replace Bill Yates is yet to be made. So I'll ask that our California members stick with us to maintain a quorum today. I'm looking here and I'm seeing none of the California members with me. So those of you online, stick with us. We need you. Then we'll move on to item number 4, approval of the minutes. In the January 25th, 2023 minutes will be available in the March 22nd, 2023 packet. So we don't have approval of minutes today. Move on to the TRPA consent calendar. This is item 5 on our agenda. There are 4 items on consent, 2 of which were reviewed by the Operations and Governance Committee, 1 which was reviewed by the Forest Health and Wildfire Committee, and 1 which wasn't reviewed by any committee. As a reminder to the public, after board discussion on this item, you may raise your hand in person to be called on or in Zoom to be unmuted by TRPA staff to share your comments. We did have one of our public weighed in and asked that we pull item 9.3, the third item there. And I wanted to see if any board members were interested in pulling that item off of consent for discussion. That's item 11.3. And if I don't have a board member, then we'll take public comment, but we don't need to pull the item. I'm not seeing anybody interested in pulling that item here in the room. Not hearing from anybody online. Okay, then we'll move forward and ask Shelley to give us a report from the Operations and Governance Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Operations and Governance obviously met earlier today and reviewed the January financial statements. Just to summarize briefly, cash flow was a negative $1.8 million for the month due to the transfer of $2.7 million of excess coverage mitigation funds to the Nevada Division of State Lands. Without this transfer, the cash flow would have been a positive 800,000 plus. TRPA's balance sheet remains strong with revenues and expenses remaining on track. And with this, the committee recommends approval.
Thank you, Shelley.
Sure.
Okay.
In connection with item number 2, the committee recommends approval of the proposed amendment to the TRPA's application filing fee schedule, which, as you may remember, was reviewed and approved in October of last year. Unfortunately, there was an error on the spreadsheet in which both the previous base fees and the new base fees were escalated. Refunds of any amount over $20 will be issued to any affected applicants. And as I indicated, the committee recommended unanimously that the revised fee schedule be approved.
Thank you, Shelley. Do any board members have comments or questions on those 2 items? I'm not seeing any hands go up online. Then we'll move on and ask for a report on our Forest Health and Wildfire Committee, Mr. Hicks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our committee met this morning and we addressed this particular item, which is the 3rd item under the consent calendar, which requires this recommendation by the committee, or requires a recommendation to be made by the committee, because our current ordinance says TRPA shall suspend acceptance of applications for biofuel facilities until further research demonstrates the safety and environmental compatibility of such facilities. There's a history to this particular ordinance. It was passed in 2012. But as we all know, there have been a lot of changes since 2012. We found today in our discussions that we have at least 3 California counties, one of which is Placer County. We also have Tuolumne and Plumas County that either have these facilities in place or are moving forward with permitting of these facilities. In particular, Plumas County has an existing facility that is in operation now. So we can look at the track record of that particular facility, even though there are some variations between the nature of its operation and what's proposed here at City of South Lake Tahoe. The other county, Tuolumne and Placer, are in the process, but they've been going through the federal permitting. system, and it's impressive that they have apparently have either completed it or are near completion of it without any problems. So, the circumstances have changed, the technology has changed, and our committee then has formulated a recommendation to recommend that the governing board accept the application for the South Tahoe refuse site, on-site biomass project. And it is really to be noted that this is sort of a test project as far as we're concerned. By suspending the suspension that this particular ordinance provides for, we're saying we have concluded that there is sufficient information at this time to allow this to be suspended, to suspend our suspension for this particular project, to take it on a further test so that we can see how it matches under our requirements when placed in compatibility or in alongside the state of California and federal requirements. So we think that we're justified in doing this. We request the governing board to approve it. We had a great deal of support from the city and different groups around involved in it. And so I think it's ready to proceed. Now, with that said, and I don't mean to ramble, but with that said, this is not an approval of the project per se. It is merely allows them to file the application so that we can take that next step and take a look at what they're proposing to do in great detail and in light of our standards. It does not commit the governing board to approving the project in any way. And assuming the project continues during the review and satisfies the review, there will be a whole variety of public hearings and comment sessions where we will be able to listen to the comments and that we anticipate will happen because it is a controversial type project. So the public is not precluded on this in any way, but it does allow us to take that next step to at least get them into the system, take a look at it, and ultimately, we believe, get it before the board for full consideration.
Thank you. Appreciate that update. Are there any questions or comments from board members on that consent item? I'm not seeing any here. Are there any online from our board that are? I'm not seeing any hands go up, but I don't see all of the hands. So help me if I miss somebody. Okay, then we'll move on. And the final consent item number 4 was not reviewed by any committee. This is the Incline High School Public Service Edition, 499 Village Boulevard, Washoe County, Nevada, assessors parcel number APN 124-071-51 and 124-071-52, TRPA file number ERSP 2022-1818. Information on this item can be found on page 141 of your packets. Are there any questions or comments from board members on that final consent item? I'm not seeing it here. Any in the room? Anyone online from our board that has a comment or question? I'm not seeing or hearing any, so we'll go to public comment on all the consent calendar items. If any member of the public wishes to address the governing board on this agenda item, please raise your hand now, either in person or by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or by dialing *9 on your phone, and you will be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. So first we'll start here in the room. Are there any members of the public that wanted to speak to us on the consent calendar? Not seeing any in the room. And do we have anyone online?
Madam Chair, there are no hands raised to comment on this item.
Okay,
Oh, excuse me, sorry. One hand just went up. Sue Lowe, if you unmute on your end, you can address the board.
I'm sorry, I raised my hand inappropriately.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Sue.
Any others?
Oh, Madam Chair, there are no hands raised.
Okay, then we'll close the public comment. We'll ask for a motion on the approval of the consent calendar.
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. We have a motion. Is there any discussion from the board or any comments or questions? If not, I'm going to pass it over to Maria for a roll call vote.
Ms. Aldine,
Yes.
Ms. Conrad Theta,
Yes.
Mr. D. Kara,
Aye.
Ms. Faustinos,
Yes.
Ms. Dis,
Yes.
Mr. Bass,
Yes.
Ms. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Honigman,
Yes.
Mr. Rice,
Yes.
Ms. Lane,
Yes.
Mr. Settlemeyer, Ms. Williamson,
Yes.
Ms. Gustafson.
Yes.
Madam Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you, Maria. And now we're on to item 6 on our agenda. This is the workshop. And 6A is Transportation Equity Workshop. And this is a briefing on the Transportation Equity Study and review of draft policy concepts and potential actions for the Keeping Tahoe Moving initiative. Information on this item can be found on page 199. And as a reminder to the public, after staff presentation and board discussion on this item, you may raise your hand in person to be called on or in the Zoom webinar to be unmuted by TRPA staff to share your comments. So with that, Kira, I'm going to turn it over to Kira Smith on our staff.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. My name is Kira Smith, Senior Transportation Planner with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency for the record. Can you go to the first slide? One moment. While she's pulling that up, I would like to mention that I'm joined today by Kendall Flint, who is the project manager for our consultant team, DKS Associates, and then also joined by Victoria Ortiz, our community engagement manager with TRPA. So we last provided an update for you on this item in August. And I know we have a couple of new board members, so I'll first provide a briefing on the work that we've done on this project to date, and then we'll move into the workshop session. And Victoria will provide instructions on what we're going to do. We'll have a couple of breakout sessions, so we'll have an opportunity to dive deeper into some of the policy ideas and actions that are proposed. How are we doing? Okay, sorry. So the next slide that you will see in a moment is the timeline slide. So I'll just get started on mentioning what we've done so far. So we started work on this project about a year ago, working with our consultants, and TRPA, as the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Tahoe Basin, is responsible for establishing the transportation framework for the Tahoe region by adopting goals and policies in the regional transportation plan every 4 years. The last regional transportation plan was adopted by the board in 2021. It's perfect. Go to the next one. The last regional transportation plan was adopted in 2021, and the transportation equity study was a recommendation from that plan. We know from the last regional transportation plan update that transportation access is increasingly difficult for some of our most vulnerable residents. And so by conducting this study, we can hopefully identify solutions to improve access and services for those communities. We are also seeing new funding opportunities coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And those discretionary funding sources are increasingly tied to equity, something that Rachel mentioned in her presentation. And so if we have a set of policies that address transportation equity, we can set the regional partners up to be more competitive for some of those funding sources. And then we're also expecting that state regional transportation plan guidelines will be updated later this year to include stricter guidelines around considering equity in regional transportation plans. And so for all of those reasons, and to improve access for our most vulnerable communities, we are conducting this study. So we last came to you in August, and we are back today seeking your input on draft policy ideas and proposed actions. And then based on the feedback that we hear from you today and feedback we collect from the public over the next couple of weeks, we'll be developing a list of draft policies and bringing that back to the board for review in early summer. Next slide. So you may have seen this graphic before and may remember it from my previous presentation in August, but I like to start off with this because I think it sets the stage for how we're thinking about equity in the context of this study. This graphic is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So you'll see on the top, it shows equality, where everyone has access to the same bicycle, but on the bottom is equity, where everyone has access to a bicycle in their size. We know that the bicycles on the bottom probably require different resources to manufacture, and they probably don't all cost the same. But the point is that everybody in that photo has mobility independence. And that's really what the focus of this study is and how we're thinking about transportation equity for Lake Tahoe. Next slide. So with that definition of equity in mind, our primary goals for this project are to identify the transportation burdens and barriers facing our community through an extensive public outreach process, to incorporate or develop tools to incorporate equity considerations into our planning and project reviews, to establish targets to measure transportation equity, to leverage some of those discretionary funding sources I mentioned. Bless you. And lastly, to provide policy recommendations to improve accessibility and transportation equity for Lake Tahoe. And so that final objective is really the focus of today's presentation and workshop. Next slide. So beginning last summer, we did a lot of public outreach to identify the barriers and burdens facing our most vulnerable communities. And we tried to focus a lot of our outreach on these communities listed because these are our most transportation disadvantaged communities. So in addition to working with some of our local community-based organizations, we also were able to identify neighborhoods in the basin with higher densities of these populations to focus some place-based outreach to really understand what the barriers are for these folks. And we were able to identify those areas using census data. Next slide. Speaking of census data, as part of this project, we also purchased a census-based data platform called My Sidewalk that displays census data for the basin with a particular focus on equity metrics. And so this platform is available on our project website. And we, in addition to aiding us with some of our demographic analysis for this project, we are hoping that this will be a valuable resource for some of our local jurisdictions when they're applying for funding and assessing projects. And I would definitely encourage you when you have a moment to go check this out online and explore some of the data. Next slide. So in the 2020 Regional Transportation Plan, our environmental justice analysis included identifying neighborhoods with higher densities of those transportation disadvantaged communities. So those priority communities that were on the previous slide. And in the 2020 RTP, we identified these 5 neighborhoods as our community priority zones, ultimately with the goal of increasing our transportation investments in these neighborhoods. And for this project in particular, we tried to focus a lot of our community outreach in these neighborhoods so that we were reaching out to the most vulnerable communities and trying to really understand what the barriers are to transportation access. Next slide. So our outreach so far on this project has included 2 focus group meetings, targeted outreach in some of those neighborhoods. We've had at least 20 different one-on-one meetings with stakeholders. We had a community survey that was translated into Spanish and Tagalog. We organized several pop-ups in neighborhoods, at farmers markets, in front of supermarkets. And then we also hosted 2 workshops in Spanish. Next slide. So this is a list of some of the stakeholders that we've met with throughout this project. And you'll see that this is a really diverse list of community partners. And it's been really interesting to meet with all of these folks because they each provide a unique perspective on transportation equity. And through this outreach and through all of these meetings, we were able to really understand and identify what the barriers are to transportation for our communities. Next slide. And through all of that outreach, we heard about a lot of different transportation barriers. And I'm going to list a couple of the highlights of some of the things that we heard from a lot of different people multiple times. So the first is availability of public transit has been a concern for a lot of people. Accessibility and safety of our transportation network, particularly in the winter and at night. The cost of transportation can be a challenge for a lot of people. Data from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Transportation indicates that on average, Tahoe residents are spending 28% of their income on transportation. And for low-income households, that figure is even higher. So that's definitely a challenge. The distance and time spent traveling can be an issue, especially for people who are commuting from outside of the basin because they can't afford to live in the basin. The adequacy of transportation conditions is a concern. One example, when sidewalks aren't cleared of snow or swept, they can deteriorate. The condition of those sidewalks can deteriorate rapidly. And then we're also hearing from a lot of people about climate and weather related events that impact the transportation network. Some examples are major winter weather events or evacuation scenarios. Next slide. So we took all of that feedback that we heard from the community and worked with our consultants over the past several months to develop this list of policy ideas, which we'll review with you today in a minute. And before we get to the workshop session, I wanted to take you through the 6 categories of policy ideas that we have developed for the workshop. And I wanted to provide a couple of examples and stories that we heard from the community directly about some of the barriers that they're facing. So under engagement, we know from our analysis that about 7% of the basin population does not speak English. And we know through our outreach that those populations really do want to be engaged. They want to provide feedback, but they feel like they don't have the opportunities to do that currently. And so you'll see that a lot of the policy ideas under the engagement section are centered around increasing those opportunities. Next slide. Under access, we focus on understanding what barriers limit mobility. We heard from a lot of different people about challenges navigating sidewalks in the winter. People can feel really unsafe when they have to walk in the street because the sidewalk hasn't been cleared of snow or because there wasn't a sidewalk in that location at all to begin with. And for people with disabilities, this can be especially challenging, and oftentimes it can be impossible. And so you'll see that a lot of the policy ideas under access are centered around increasing access and addressing some of those challenges. Next slide. There are a lot of different policy ideas under infrastructure. And one thing that we heard from the community is that there is a need for increased access to broadband, and the community is definitely supportive of seeing advancements in transportation infrastructure technologies like electric vehicle charging infrastructure. But there are also concerns about, for example, installing an electric vehicle charging station in a low-income neighborhood and who that would actually serve. Next slide. Under services, we heard about the need for prioritized lifeline services, which are services that people depend on to get to work, school, or to access healthcare or groceries. One example we heard from the Lake Tahoe Community College is that their English as a second language classes typically occur at night. And this is usually after the TTD bus services end for the day. And so the students in those ESL classes, if they don't have their own car, when they get out of class, they have to find their own way home by walking, biking, or in some cases, taking a taxi. And this can be really challenging, sometimes dangerous if it's dark, and sometimes it can just be really cost prohibitive for a lot of those people. And then we also heard from a couple stakeholders, particularly the homeless coalitions and Live Violence Free, that bus drivers are often on the front lines when people are experiencing mental health crises, and that by providing tools for those bus drivers to handle those situations when they arise, it could improve safety on buses, improve the perception of safety on transit, and mitigate some transportation risks for really vulnerable riders. Next slide. So under, in regards to environment-related transportation barriers, we heard a lot about concerns stemming from climate change. The number one concern we heard from almost every single stakeholder that we talked to was about concerns around evacuation scenarios. And we had the chance to communicate with a lot of community members about their experiences evacuating from the Caldor fire. We heard there were some instances where families have 10 or more family members and share one car amongst all of them. And in some cases, they chose not to evacuate because they couldn't fit all 10 people in their car and they didn't feel like they had other options. And then we also heard from the homeless coalitions and the senior centers whose residents depend almost entirely on public transit. They don't have access to their own vehicles. And those agencies felt like in the Caldor fire evacuation, they were successful in evacuating because they had a lot of time to prepare, but they worry about situations in which they wouldn't have as much time. Next slide. And so this is our sixth policy category, technology. And the community is definitely supportive of deploying more transportation technologies, but there are also concerns about ensuring that technology-based transportation improvements are still accessible. We heard from a couple community members without phones that they are really dependent on the bus schedules, and sometimes they'll show up to a bus stop, and if the bus isn't there when it's scheduled to be there, they'll start walking. So ensuring that they have accessible real-time information will be really critical. Next slide. Okay, so this is the last thing I wanted to mention before we pause for questions. But this is the draft equity index scorecard, and this is attachment B in your packet. I think it's on page 205. So the scorecard was developed for TRPA staff to consider these 7 areas when reviewing proposed projects, programs, and transportation investments. And Kendall will walk you through this in the policy section, but we just wanted to bring this up before we pause for questions. So next slide. So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions on what I just presented on. If you do have policy specific questions, we'll ask you to save those for the workshop session, and Victoria will mention in a moment how we're going to do that and give you instructions for how to move into our breakout groups.
Well, thank you, Kira. Any comments or questions from the board at this point? We'll get those answered in the workshops, I would think, in our summary. Julie, you wanted to make a quick announcement?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Madam Chair. Julie Reagan, TRPA Executive Director. Great presentation to Kira and the team. Before we break into groups, I just wanted to scale up a little rationale for why we're doing this workshop. A couple of reasons. We've had a lot of discussion today around transportation. So it really intersects our MPO role, that Metropolitan Planning Organization role, with our land use authority, but really highlighting the beauty of the compact language that ties those two together in land use planning. And we have that really unique authority in the country to make meaningful differences around those two topics. I also wanted just a little housekeeping detail to remind the board that we do have a regional plan implementation committee following at the conclusion of the regular board meeting. And I do have a brief executive director report. So just wanted to ask you to hang on a little bit longer after the workshop concludes. And it really has been the goal of John Hester, myself, and our entire team since our workshop last May to have more interactive opportunities in the form of workshops. And so this is one in a series of many that you'll be having throughout the rest of the year. So our team has done a lot of on-the-spot rearranging the logistics due to this beautiful gift of snow that we had and less people in the room and more people on Zoom. But I think we have a great program for you. So really appreciate your care and attention. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so I'll invite Victoria Ortiz up to give you instructions.
And Madam Chair.
We just had two questions online.
Go ahead, Ashley.
I just had a question on the statistic. Well, first of all, thanks for the presentation. It was thorough and I really like the description of the policy areas. I'm looking forward to the workshop and wish I could be there in person. But just a question on some of the stats you shared, for example, on the percentage of non-English speakers. Was that a census provided information or additional information? And also homeless access. I feel like some of those numbers can be undercounts. And so I was just wondering where your data came from. So we have a sense of really, how, what the error might be in those demand numbers.
Yeah, so the 7% figure comes from our latest Title VI and limited English proficiency plan updates, which I believe was maybe 2 years ago, and that data is from the census.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Who else had a hand up?
Cindy, that was me, Belinda.
Oh, great, Belinda. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And not so much of a question, it's just an observation. I really appreciate the fact that this whole process has been prioritized and, clearly, funding is an incentive a lot of times when it has dedicated resources for disadvantaged communities and such. But I just hope that this does not become just a flash in the pan and that it is something that TRPA consistently incorporates in all of their policy decision-making is how to be more inclusive, making sure that in particular those audiences that don't have, or people rather in the community that don't have access to broadband and frankly don't know government and what that process is all about and how they can participate. And I know that in one of the bits of the report that I read, there was a description of maybe having leadership type academies, basically civics 101 for community members that don't usually participate in these kinds of discussions. And I just want to, voice my strong support for that approach. It really does, change the whole paradigm of how the broader community feels like they can participate in this process and feels welcome. So I just wanted to put that out there as a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? If not, Victoria, go ahead. You're up.
You can tell. Hello, good afternoon, Chairwoman, members of the board. My name is Victoria Ortiz, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager with TRPA. And I am going to be guiding you through the workshop portion of this item. So unsurprisingly, for a transportation workshop, we are going to get you moving, at least here in person. So in just a minute, we will be splitting into 3 different groups, and we will have all of the members of the board going into the the Marlette room. Is that right? Yes, the Marlette room, which is just outside and across the hall here. And then we are going to be splitting all of the online members into 2 groups, and I will split that up here in a moment. My mistake. The in-person will be in the Washoe room, which is that direction. Fortunately, all those in person can see me pointing. So once you get to your room, you will stay there for the entire duration of the workshop. We will have 15 minutes for Kira, Kendall, and myself to go through the policy ideas and potential action items, and the facilitators will rotate so that you don't have to. We're asking that members of the public, thank you for being here today, whether in person or virtual, will please stay with our online governing board members in this room that we're currently in, the Tahoe room. And if the public has any comments or feedback, we encourage you to submit them via Mentimeter, which is an online platform, and you can see at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you just go to menti.com and use that code, and that's how you will be submitting your comments. Catherine will be monitoring the Mentimeter, and then after about 45 minutes, we will all come back together here into the Tahoe room, and each of the facilitators will take a couple minutes to share high-level feedback that we heard on those policy ideas. We'll have time for some brief board discussion, followed by public comment. So just to reiterate, all public comment will be at the end of the meeting. I also want to note that we are going to have a second Zoom virtual breakout room, and the link to that should be in your chat right now. And then it's also on the trpa.gov homepage on the main slider. So next slide, please. Thank you. While you're in your breakout groups, we want you to be thinking of one really important question, and that is, what are the most important policy ideas and actions for us to focus on here? So what you should be thinking about are ideas that you support, any clarifications that you might have or questions, and then any comments or concerns that you see listed here. So we have that in all of the rooms, but please keep that main question in mind of what should we be focusing on. So any questions before I split us into our online groups?
MV, can I clarify something?
Please.
Can you turn off your mic? Sorry, for board members who are going to be broken into the second virtual room, you should have your invite in your inbox right at the top.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so on this Zoom, so the folks online who do not need to move, that's going to be Mr. Bass, Ms. Faustinos, Ms. Aldine, and Mr. DeCara. For those who are going on to the Zoom link that's in your chat, that's going to be Ms. Conrad Seda, Ms. Lane, Mr. Honigman, and Mr. Rice. So those folks will be moving to the new Zoom link that's in the chat, in your inbox, and on the slider on the trpa.gov website. All those who are here in person, once again, will be moving to the Washoe room just over there. All right, I think we're all set. For everybody who's online, we'll just give it one more minute for folks to get where they're going. And just to make sure on this Zoom, we should have Mr. Bass, Ms. Faustinos, Ms. Aldine, and Mr. DeCara.
Yep, I'm here. This is Mr. Bass.
Hey, this is
Great,
Gabriel
thank
DeCare.
you. All right, well, let's get started. Here on this Zoom, we're going to start with the draft engagement policy ideas. And I would love this to be open forum. So if you have any questions, comments as I'm speaking, please feel free to jump right in. So we'll start high level. The first policy idea under engagement is commit to respectfully engaging underserved populations. And this could be done in a variety of ways. So under potential action items, we have some ideas there. We have incentives for participation. So this could include financial incentives. This could include gift cards. For some folks, we ended up providing gift cards to a local grocery store for people to participate in our stakeholder study. And then we also have meet them where they are. So this means rather than requiring folks to come to us in our public meetings, we can do outreach at community events or go to meetings that are already happening at these community-based organizations. And that was a way that we actually found to be really successful in getting feedback on this study. We also have ask clearly. So as Kira mentioned on the presentation, about 7% of the population here does not speak English as their primary language. So for the purpose of this study, we translated all of our main materials, especially the fact sheets. We also want to make sure that any summary documents are translated. And we had some conversations about should we be translating everything? And what we heard back was, no one wants to necessarily read the 400-page CEQA document in Spanish, but let's make sure that all high-level documents are indeed translated. We also have on here, ask once. So what this means is oftentimes, as many of you are aware, we have several public meetings simultaneously that are variations on similar themes or about specific projects. They said, hey, it'd be great if you could come to us once and have different stations where you're getting feedback on a bunch of different topics simultaneously, rather than multiple meetings on similar topics. We also have ask simultaneously. So we heard from Bill Martinez at the Family Resource Center that during the Caldor evacuation, there was Spanish translation on some items, and that unfortunately that didn't happen simultaneously. And so as information was changing minute by minute, day by day, oftentimes that Spanish outreach was more of an afterthought, and the information could be incorrect or outdated by the time it was sent out. So we want to make sure that as we are releasing information, we are doing so simultaneously. Any questions on that first policy idea or any thoughts, comments?
Hi, this is Gabriel DeCare for Secretary Aguilar. I just have a quick question. So 7% of the population in the area is non-native English speakers. Is that as a first language or at all?
Great question. So that was according, as Kira mentioned, to the US Census data. And so that is how people are recording their primary language.
Do we have any data on secondary language?
I can get back to you on that. What I can tell you is that when we reached out to the Tagalog community, what we heard from some of the younger folks is that almost everybody spoke English and used that primarily to communicate. And then with the older folks who spoke Tagalog, their English was not as at such a high standard. So it might have been a little more difficult. But we did translate our survey into Tagalog, and someone said, "Oh, this isn't quite right." So there's room for improvement there.
Got it. Thank you. And a lot of these principles make a lot of sense to me, especially given, again, as you noted, the complexity of some of this, being able to show up on a community's terms instead of having them meet our terms makes a lot of sense. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in, this is Belinda, that, definitely very supportive of all the policy points that you were made with it nested within, how to respectfully engage with the underserved populations and by experience, having a respectful reimbursement policy, for that time, the value of the time that community members are making, to be able to participate, because, otherwise they might be out working that third job that they need to keep, keep their bills paid. So I really think that that is an important element. And you didn't mention this, but I'm assuming that probably there was some kind of child watch services provided at some of these meetings, so that families that don't have any resources for childcare can actually participate in the meetings. That's something that I think is an important element to this, to make sure that, and that there is, some accompanying activity, for children that are of an age, obviously, that could understand this stuff, that they actually get information, that's relevant to the meeting topic. And I would emphasize that simultaneous translation is really important to the extent that it can be done, in particular, so that it's not a distraction within the room, and it's a little bit more expensive, but getting that actual translation equipment so that they can hear the translation, as it's being given through a translator, as opposed to having, making the meeting longer with having several different types of translation, including sign language. I think that's another thing that we miss sometimes. So, we just suggest that, budgets allowing, if you buy that equipment and you use it for multiple purposes, it pays for itself, I think, pretty quickly.
Thank you so much, Ms. Falcinos. And I would love to clarify that when we say incentives for participation, that could be monetary, that could be childcare, that could be food, that could encompass quite the gamut of incentives.
Right. Great.
Shelley, I was going to actually, I'd like to tee off of Belinda's comment. We have stipends mentioned in the third box down for participating in various meetings, and the distinguishment between incentives and stipends. I mean, stipends are typically something that is a reimbursement, which is certainly reasonable, money permitting. Hopefully we don't have to use a lot of incentives to get people to participate, as long as they are made whole as a result of their participation. Because I think it's a little like paying people to vote. I mean, this is being done obviously to assist people in need. And I would hope, that if we merely agreed to provide them with stipends to reimburse them for, loss of work time, if they have to attend during the work week, transportation costs, that sort of thing. But I would prefer that it be a reimbursement rather than a financial or food incentive, because I think that kind of diminishes the importance of the program if we're paying people to get involved. On the other hand, I think it's important that we make arrangements to reimburse them for their out-of-pocket costs. That's my only comment. I mean, I was involved in the Circles Initiative in Carson City. I helped begin the Circles Initiative years ago, and it helps elevate people out of generational poverty. And we always provided stipends as opposed to incentives, because we felt that the program itself, was helping people become more financially self-sufficient. And so they should be reimbursed for out-of-pocket costs, but hopefully they would agree to participate because there was an upside to participation in the long term.
Great. Thank you, Shelley. I do want to keep
Yeah,
us, I
this
know we
is
have
a
about
Commissioner
15
Beck.
minutes for each. Oh, sorry. Yes, Cody, please.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks. So yeah, I couldn't agree more about the interpretation services. We brought on a company actually in the city that helps us with that for our live meetings as well as just the agenda items. And in the way that, yeah, you only want to post things maybe that have to be always posted agenda-wise in Spanish and English, but I think on request, and it should be well known to the public that on request they could get different informational items interpreted. And I think that's crucial for people to want to actually get engaged and involved, is they want to be understanding of everything that we're in the know of. So I think we should look at the services that can provide that. And because I think as we talk about engagement, that's what is going to get people engaged, is for them to really feel a part of the process. And they've got to have all of the info, and if they can only read it in one language, we need to provide it for them in that language. I do think, participation, I kind of agree, like we want people to get engaged because they really want to be engaged. And I think we're going to talk about providing the service next, but I think that's really what gets people engaged, is getting them the service that they really feel isn't being provided, that they do need to participate in the community and in our economy. And so I think once we get to there, then looking at how do we get the leaders of these underserved communities engaged in our process so they can deliver to us what we as a board will bring back to make it a more equitable service all around.
Thank you, Cody. And that actually brings up another point a little further down. So I'm going to skip the second one for now and go to add diverse voices to influential boards and committees. And this speaks to what you were just describing, Cody, in terms of, we call it a community academy. We're calling it a citizens academy, and we heard back that might be a little bit exclusive as well, considering that not everybody in our community is a citizen. So a community academy that trains people on different government processes so that they too can have a track to get involved and engaged. And you'll note stipends for participation. So hopefully that too speaks to what Shelley, you and Belinda were speaking about in terms of reimbursements, and we can certainly adjust that language. And that also has the idea of hosting roundtables or even meet and greets at popular gathering places so that there's a track for people to connect with the existing decision makers and boards and committees.
Yeah. And as a precursor to that, I really highly recommend going through some kind of a leadership training program. And maybe that's not the right terminology to use, but something that really, evens out the playing field in terms of understanding acronyms and just all of the, government gobbledygook that we all speak, because that's what we do, in our daily jobs. And that's not a language that the community members that are not in that realm are going to be accustomed to. So I think that, making sure that they are, and again, to the extent that it's reasonable to understand, what the issues are that are going to be talked about and discussed. And I think that it just gives them the tools, I think, to be more effective partners in all of this. And I guess the other thing about compensation that I will say is that, having done this in a public agency context and in a nonprofit, that, many times, these leaders then get pinged and asked to do many, many different things. And ultimately, I think that those, because everyone else, well, not everyone, the majority of the other people participating in some of these discussions on boards and commissions, it was part of their day job to represent their organization at these tables. And community members, didn't have, anything financially to back them up for being there, in particular, since many of these meetings were during the day. So I think it's an important issue to recognize. And I understand, Shelley, the comment you were making earlier about compensation, but it is, it is one of those thorny issues that I think that we have to identify that, for some members of the community, they just really don't have, we have to respect them for the value that they're bringing to the table. And that this is not part of their day job, and that we should figure out how to get them some type of justifiable compensation, whether it's a stipend or reimbursement, whatever it might be. But I think we'll get more participation that way.
Thank you, Ms. Fastinos. I know we have about a minute and a half left, so I know we have two other items on here. I would love to get your feedback on targeting a percentage of outreach efforts on these underserved populations. And we could, of course, use some of the best practices that we discussed in that first topic area. Any thoughts from the board on those?
I'm sorry, targeting, where are we now? Are we on add diverse?
Yep. On the second item, it says target the second draft policy idea, target a percentage of outreach efforts on underserved populations. And what this means is right now we don't have any targets, nor does everybody track how much of their time is going towards these underserved populations. So we would propose that we could track that and target a specific percentage.
Well, maybe how much time have you been spending recently? I mean, obviously, this is kind of, this is during the formation process, so you're going to spend a lot more time, putting all of these lists together of potential policy ideas. But I mean, I would think that staff would have a better idea of what it takes to, if all of these policies are adopted, what it's going to take to implement them. I hate to be arbitrary and just throw out a percentage because I really don't know what your workload is on other issues having to do with agency business. I think feedback from staff based on your experience would be valuable.
Great. Thank you, Shelley.
One more thing I wanted to add when we were talking about leadership training. Does the Chamber of Commerce have a leadership program? Most chambers do. And
they do. Yes, and we certainly don't want to duplicate any efforts, but we want to make sure that there are good through lines.
What I was going to suggest is maybe you can get some sponsorships for members of underserved populations to go through the training. It can be a little pricey. I know we have a similar program down here in Carson City, and it can be relatively expensive, but even then, employees of certain corporate members of the chamber will sponsor them through the program. But in the absence of that, maybe, a philanthropic organization or community involved companies can sponsor a couple of people through the program and target some underserved populations to be the recipients of those call it a scholarship.
Certainly. Great idea.
And I'll just say that targeting a percentage, I think.
Quick, Gabriel DeCara. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Gabriel. I'll chime in later.
I was just going to for outreach, absolutely. It may not always be, it may be higher than the percentage of the population because underserved populations almost by definition take longer to reach. I think that it's absolutely worth the effort, especially when we're talking about this type of plan.
I'm sorry, Mr. DeCara, it was a little difficult to hear you.
Oh, just targeting a percentage of time to reach out to underserved populations absolutely makes sense. And it may need to be a larger percentage of time than the population makes up because by definition, underserved populations are more difficult to serve.
Understood. Great. Thank you. So at this point, we are going to be switching. So you will have your next facilitator coming in here shortly, and that will be Kendall, who will be describing access, infrastructure, and technology. So I want to say thank you very much for the feedback that you gave me so far, and enjoy the rest of this workshop.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. We had a little technical difficulty in the other room, but I think everything's working well now. Again, I'm Kendall Flint. I'm the project manager with DKS, and I'm going to be walking you through the policies that are related to draft infrastructure. And we're going to talk a little bit about access, and then we're also going to talk about environment. So on the first idea here with infrastructure, this is really the physical environment within the basin. So we're trying to find ways to make sure that policies and programs take a look at things like our equity index scorecard, which is in your packet. It's not to say that every project and program have to comply with all 7 of these things, but these are criteria that staff should look at as a guidance document to find out whether or not there's opportunities to make that work. The other thing we heard in the infrastructure portion was really supporting infrastructure that improves accessibility for all different types of modalities. And that would be everything from including wider trails for people that might be using a wheelchair, or being able to look at things that have bike racks or other types of things so that people can access other places in the valley or in the basin. And if you look at the last one, there is also encouraging multimodal transportation options, which is making sure that we do have the ability to use other types of ways of getting around in general. If you go to the next slide for me. I'm wearing in my trifocals and I can barely see that slide. There we go. One of the other things on that one was looking for making access better for people that are on bikes or pedestrian, and then looking at intelligent transportation systems and broadband investment. And the pieces on this that are really important is it's not just for people to access the internet, and watch Netflix. It's really for getting people connected during an emergency, and also connecting technology that can tie our lights and traffic signals and other things together so that we can move people throughout the basin more efficiently and in a safer manner, which makes that all that intelligent transportation work really well. So I want to pause here for a second and open up to hear your comments or questions about these that relate to infrastructure and access. And
oh, sorry.
Kendall, I guess I had a question during the main board meeting, the presentation on the transportation equity study and the policy ideas. There was kind of there was a comment about gentrifying neighborhoods by installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Can you clarify?
Absolutely. So one of the concerns that we heard, and frankly, it's not unique to Tahoe, so this is, you're not alone on this. One of the things we found a lot of support for is the idea of when you have multifamily housing opportunities, that there is an electric vehicle charging station that's there. And perhaps there's an encouragement for things like Zipcar or other type of shared mobility. Because what we heard in some of those neighborhoods is that, they can't afford to buy an electric vehicle. So they don't really want to have an electric vehicle charging station necessarily on site. But what you're seeing in California, and actually in a number of other states right now, are groups going out there and providing that service through Zipcar or a shared situation, which then provides that access to low-income users that would like to take advantage of it. So that type of thing, as opposed to dropping in EV charging stations in neighborhoods where people were concerned that that might shift the type of user or the values of that, or not the values, the access in that community. They just want to make sure that it's a benefit for that community, as opposed to being a amenity that might already exist somewhere else, if that makes sense.
So wouldn't a way of doing that, wouldn't it be, a lot of these charging stations are accessible to anyone. Why can't you lock them and make them available only to the occupants of that housing project?
You absolutely can. And actually there's a couple we've worked on that are coded, so you get like a key code for it, and that unlocks it or locks it for you. So that's completely possible to do. And I think also on the, going back a little bit on the broadband side too, that really is making sure, again, that you have the opportunity for these systems that can also provide real-time bus information, multilingual signage, all that kind of stuff. So any other comments or questions on these particular type of policies or things that this group really supports or has concerns about?
Yeah, on the ITS systems, in particular, when it comes to, I think the comment that we heard in the board meeting was about, people not knowing, when the bus is coming. And it seems like, there, and I have seen this system and I can't remember what city it was in, where, there was a, basically a device, at each bus stop that told you how far away the bus was, so that you would get that information in real time. And I think that's a kind of infrastructure that would, again, be relevant to anyone that's trying to use public transportation. We just need to make sure that it's, done in a way that the information is easily communicated regardless of your language. So that would be something that I would think, from an equity perspective, to make that a high priority, that would be great. And in terms of some of the other policy recommendations regarding accessibility, the studying the opportunities for having separate pathways, for cyclists and pedestrians is, I think, really important, and making sure that those pedestrian pathways are wide enough so that they can easily accommodate wheelchairs is critically important. So those would be my suggestions there.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the one thing that stood out for us also on the ITS side is currently, if you've ever, we've all driven in South Lake as you're going through town by the casinos, all of those lights are independently operated. So in an ITS system, you can tie that all together so that lights are timed appropriately. And then if you did have an evacuation event, you're able to get people out in a more efficient manner than we could have done previously. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of people express a lot of support for. Okay.
This is Gabriel DeCara on behalf of Secretary Aguilar. Do we have, this is a super basic question, but is there information on how much of the, the Tahoe area, the public infrastructure, how much of that is currently ADA compliant, or if there's any outstanding areas that are not currently in compliance?
So I'll have to look into that. I know with the most recent RTP and other projects and programs that have been done by TRPA, anything that's been, new projects that are managed, those are going to be ADA compliant, but there may be some gaps. I think the other issue is that there are definitely within the neighborhoods, there are sidewalks and other places that are not necessarily ADA compliant, but that's usually caused by damage from snow or from other things that are there. So this particular policy would look at that and try to develop an approach to correcting that. In our in my sidewalk data, which is available on the project website, there are a number of indicators that look at things like that, and you can kind of see from specific areas where we've got some room for improvement. But I don't know how the specific percentages off my head.
Thank you very much.
Kendall, so it probably varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but in many jurisdictions, removing, even though sidewalks may be in the city or county's right of way, responsibility for removing snow on those sidewalks rests with the adjacent property owner. I know that's correct in Carson City. I'm assuming that's the case in South Tahoe and other jurisdictions around the lake. The challenge is when you have a winter like we had this year, that can be very difficult to enforce because you've got a finite number of people who with shovels, who have, snow blowers and can actually do the. But I assume that the local jurisdictions are attempting to enforce that requirement, as much as possible, especially in these priority zones that are being identified.
Yeah, I think we had that discussion actually with a number of representatives from the cities and also some of the local businesses. And one of the challenges is that even if Caltrans or other people have things in place to remove snow and bring it back, when you have some of the epic snows we've had of late, they can't possibly do everything all at the same time. So there's always going to be some gaps in there. And so it is a challenge. But we are working with local agencies to figure out if there's some solutions. I want to move on to a couple of these other areas because I'm being told.
Could I speak? This is Commissioner.
Sure, absolutely.
This is Commissioner Bass. So I would just like to speak on, one of the projects that I brought forward to the council and we got unanimous support for, which is a very multimodal and kind of different idea than I think's ever been presented, but it is essentially to build a gondola similar to that you see on ski resorts, but they're designed in more of an urban way that would go from our State Line Transit Center all the way to the mobility hub at the Y that we would construct with a parking structure. And it would have 5 stops throughout South Lake in each one of our town centers that would come through And it would operate just like you see normal ski gondolas operate. And what it would do is it would essentially operate as our main line, and we would never have another bus run along Highway 50. And microtransit would be able to use that as a link. So they would be able to drop at any one of those 5 stations to get people through the town, and it would connect the tourist core to the Y for the Emerald Bay solution for the transit that we need to provide out to the Emerald Bay. And so we have actually, me and the mayor and city manager, Public Works, went to Marysville to meet with Caltrans last week. And on a very, high level, haven't even, begun feasibility, just presented this to their entire kind of district leads. And they thought that, wow, this is actually something that does, at least at a high level, something to look at. And so I want to,
I apologize for kind of, but this came up just before the meeting. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. I think it's a great idea. And we're going to incorporate that.
Why I'd like to bring, I think when we talk about infrastructure or multimodal or something that this committee could talk about bringing forward, we are going to want to look at TRPA for just the feasibility support on it. Because again, when you look at the carbon reduction from something like this, from never having to have a bus run again on Highway 50 or replace those buses, the tires on those buses, it's something that's very in line with the goals of California. And this is a project that would happen entirely within the city. So I just want to bring it forward because I think this is exactly the topics that we were just talking about.
No, it's perfect. And we're definitely going to incorporate that into some of the materials that we'll be presenting. I've got 2 other sessions to go, or 2 other sections to go through with you briefly. The draft service policy, again, the big takeaways on this one, if you had a chance to read the attachments, one was we want to make sure that bus drivers there's an opportunity to provide frontline training, because very oftentimes they're the first people that are going to see folks that are in some sort of distress. And then we also really want to look at and prioritize unmet transit needs and perhaps create some sort of a interregional discussion, but from both the public and the private sector about ways to manage that, because we're finding that there are still a lot of gaps, and whether that's a time of day gap or it's an expense gap, that was an area. And then we talked a little bit, of course, about how we want to maybe change some of the transit agencies' timing of services and incentivize that and or work with them more collaboratively. So I'd love to hear some thoughts from y'all on services policy ideas and what your feedback is on that.
Kendall, I don't know.
I'll speak to this because I think I directly deal with the TTD service more probably than most here. And I think we need to have service demands that meet the workforce needs. And clearly the service that's being delivered now is not doing that and for many, many years at this point. So I think that we need to look at a new service model, which could become, going to the private sector to provide the main line, that really the microtransit infills. We've got recent big commitments into microtransit, and I think that's great, but we definitely need a main line that serves the workforce, which means going till midnight. It means really creating service metrics that have to be followed. And I think the boards need to put that direction forward to have it implemented and make sure that that standard is met.
Great. Other comments on services before we move to our last one?
Quickly,
Let me
just
go
want to
ahead
say that I totally support the idea of the crisis training. I think that's an essential need that we have across the board in all areas of our states. It's just in particular, for dealing with issues of equity. I think that's really, really an important issue.
Thank you for that. Well, let's go to the last slide before V kicks me out. Draft environmental policies, which is basically trying to get greater use of transit and then supporting education and regional evacuation and emergency planning. And one of the things that we heard from first responders, this would be both the fire department and others, was that there hasn't been a completely coordinated basin-wide effort, and that might not be something for TRPA to lead, but certainly to support and encourage so that there's better interagency cooperation. We already have mutual aid. It's not that, it's just really about getting into it a little bit deeper. And then the other piece was encouraging greater use of transit. And one of the policies on this one, it may be to incentivize carpooling or taking buses to major resorts or major attractions that come in certainly the gondola would be a great way to get people onto public transit and opposed to buses. But anyway, the idea here was, finding ways to encourage people in a way that makes sense to them. Most people said they didn't take transit because it didn't go where they wanted to go, when they wanted to go there, and it took too long. So there's a lot of rotating things with that. Would love to hear your thoughts on draft environmental policy ideas and where you think we should be going.
This doesn't deal directly with that topic, I suppose, but we heard a comment earlier in the meeting about from the public, or maybe it was from a member of staff. It's been a long day. About emergency evacuations and the fact that some people couldn't evacuate because they didn't have a car. I think that in addition to developing these government related plans, I think there needs to be a greater effort to develop neighborhood support groups within individual communities. So, in the event of a fire, a future fire, and evacuation is required, that these neighborhood support groups can pre-identify people who have means of transportation and assign them certain families to help them evacuate in the event of an emergency. I mean, I think it needs to be kind of, this approach needs to not only focus on government services, but focus on services that other people can render to others.
Right. We're talking definitely public and private, and I apologize, but I'm getting the nod to move to the next. We needed more time on these. Thank you so much for your time. I'm tossing back.
Hello, everybody. So you're in luck because you do have more time to talk about environment. My two sections were services and environment, and I think Kendall might have gone through a couple of the services and environment policies. So can you go back to services? I am gonna check in and see if there was anything on this list that you wanted to discuss more in depth. And again, just a reminder, we're really looking for your input on what policies you support. Do you have any questions or need clarification? Are we missing anything? Do you have concerns about any of these policy ideas? And then we'd also be asking for your input on some of the action items, and I'd be happy to go through any of those if you have questions.
When you're talking about prioritizing Lifeline services, I'm assuming you're not referring to the Lifeline, the company that provides Lifeline devices.
No, that's correct. We are referring to services that people typically use to access or that people depend on to get to work, school, or to access healthcare. This one is interesting. If you'll see action item number 2 listed next to this one, facilitate mega region transit or a specialized transit roundtable to support interregional transit options. That's something that we've been talking a lot about because we're hearing from the community that interregional transit options are really critical for people who are accessing healthcare in the valley because it's not readily available in the basin, or people who are traveling down to Carson to buy groceries at Walmart because they're cheaper than in the basin. And we're encountering challenges with identifying funding to provide a lot of those sources. One of the issues that we're seeing is that the funding that's currently used to operate those services in between South Shore and Carson City, for example, is rural funding. And because the basin is designated as an urbanized area, that would limit us from using urban formula funding that we receive for transit services to operate transit back and forth. And so all of the money that's used is discretionary, and that just limits us in what we can do. And so we're considering potential policy options that we could adopt in the next regional transportation plan to maybe ease some of those burdens. But I would be interested to hear anybody's thoughts on that.
Sure, this is Commissioner Bass. So, I think that, yeah, you really point out a lot of really things that I agree with around the fact that we need to provide the transit between the Valley and Tahoe. We have a huge amount of our workforce there. And I think that it is very complicated with the amounts of funding that we try to split between two states and the rural and the MPO. And I've commonly thought, is it time to really look at, and I spoke about this in the committee meeting before, was that do we really need to look at South Lake money that's for South Lake Tahoe in the same way that we designate this funding for Placer County operates for South Lake Tahoe? And you take all Nevada state money and federal funds and you use that to operate Nevada transit. And the Nevada transit really does lie between Carson City and South Lake, or State Line, excuse me, and Douglas County, Gardnerville and Minden, and State Line. And if that was the focus, then, and that was operated by, whether it was TTD or a service that Douglas County and Carson came together, TTD is probably the best place for it. They have their own funding to provide real headway between those communities. And I think that would transform our ability to attract workforce. I think we're losing a huge amount of workforce due to the fact that we don't have real headway and transit between where we know a lot of our workforce exists. They're going to other places in northern Nevada to work instead of coming to Tahoe. So I think that's, to me, something that is a large policy thing that really needs to be dove into farther. Because in the city of South Lake, our main focus is the main line. That's a 7-mile stretch that is the biggest, densest part of traffic within the entire basin. And us trying to split and figure out, I commonly wonder, is it better for us to take and split that so that we can provide the best level of service for everybody?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That could definitely be something we could consider. Any other thoughts on that particular item?
It was mentioned earlier that, developing private-public partnerships is important to this effort. And I don't know if this would work or not, but if you had, for example, a large company like Costco, and I suspect a lot of people come down from the lake to shop at Costco in Carson City, if they would provide something that is similar to a gambling junket, but it would be a shopping junket, where they actually have a dedicated van, that moves up the hill into South Lake Tahoe, transports people down to the store to shop, has adequate room on the van for the placement of any items that are purchased. But, if you can sell an idea to a company like Costco, which is a big company, I suspect that they might embrace the idea of expanding their market, in a more meaningful way to areas in Tahoe. They might be willing to provide some money to help subsidize the cost of a van for that purpose.
That's a really unique, interesting idea. Would you support maybe a policy that speaks to advancing more of those public-private partnerships or something along those lines?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're also seeing from the state regional transportation plan guidelines that there are plans to incorporate more guidelines around establishing public-private partnerships. So I think that that's definitely in line with where the transportation world is moving. So that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I would ditto that suggestion. It's amazing that we have a local, one of these mall type things that is the discount stores. And there are actual buses that are shuttles that are provided from the train station to these discount stores. And, they're fully paid for by the discount mall, to provide that transit. So I would think that there definitely would be some interest in that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I want to move on into sidewalk clearing, because that's been an issue that we've heard from a lot of the community members, and something that we discussed more at length in the other two groups too. I don't know if you've talked about that yet already, but I would like to get your thoughts about some of the ideas that we're considering around that, and the role that TRPA plays in particular is when we permit a lot of these big projects, these new sidewalk infrastructure projects, we require the local jurisdictions to submit to us information about who is responsible for the maintenance of those investments. And so there could be potentially opportunities for for TRPA to be a little bit more strict in what we're requiring before we permit a project. Maybe there needs to be agreements in place between the responsible maintenance party and the local jurisdiction. But there could also be opportunities for TRPA to support by providing maybe snow clearing routes or data or information, but that's just a big issue that we've heard. And so I would definitely like to get your thoughts about it.
Yeah, so this is Commissioner Bass. I'll speak from the city of South Lake Tahoe. We've had an ordinance on the book for this, but we were not actively enforcing it up until really about a month ago. And we have now sent letters to all the property owners, letting them know, giving them a month heads up before we begin to issue fines. And we've actually seen pretty good results. I think if anybody's noticed along Highway 50, you've started to see people starting to dig out. So we have the ordinance on the books. I feel like we're going to get compliance throughout throughout our business owners and different commercial property owners. The thing that we do run into challenges are between, tenants that are maybe residential and don't have, they're a renter and not the property owner, and whose responsibility. So there are some issues there, but that's from our perspective, how we're dealing with it. We definitely have the ordinance, and why it wasn't enforced, I can't really answer. That was for, I think, the ordinance had been on the books a long time, and it just kind of was something that fell through the cracks, I guess you could say.
Cody, part of the problem I've noticed down in Carson City, and it's even a greater issue up in the Tahoe Basin, is that property owners will diligently, after a snowstorm, clear their sidewalks, only to have the city cover those sidewalks again as they're clearing the streets that are adjacent to those sidewalks. And so then it becomes a huge burden on the property owner if they have to clear not only snow that falls, but snow that's actually thrown by snow removal equipment onto the sidewalks. I mean, it really is a local jurisdiction issue, and how, in terms of how it's handled with the individual property owners. But, I don't know does South Lake have a center of the road stacking area?
Yeah, we do. Well, it's Caltrans, so Highway 50 is managed by the state, and yes, they push everything to the berm and they move it with dump trucks, which does help those property owners, so they're not blowing. But in our other areas where we don't have that type of system, where we've gotten so much snow this year, we're running out of places to put it, essentially. And yeah, it ends up, whether it's driveways or people, places where people have cleared. And yes, you're right, it's a local issue. We've got to come up with the solutions for business owners when that happens. We're trying to get smaller equipment to help when we do create a berm, a smaller piece of equipment that can help remove it. So anyways, yes, I completely agree with you.
Great. Any other thoughts about sidewalk clearing or ways that TRPA could potentially adopt policies to improve sidewalk clearing?
Well, TRPA can't be everything to everyone. I think that what you've listed here, and that is, maybe working with the local jurisdictions to identify priority zones for snow removal, would be the extent of TRPA's involvement, I think. I would hate to see the agency get involved, with snow removal enforcement efforts. I really think that should be left to the local jurisdictions.
Great, thank you. Can you move to environment, the next slide? So I know I heard that you were talking about evacuation planning when I walked in, and I want to circle back to that. The question that I've been asking the other two groups is, where do you see TRPA playing a role in evacuation planning? This really has become an equity issue and a focus of this study, I think, in that we're hearing this is a major concern from a lot of the community members and stakeholders that we've talked to. And so I think what we would really like to know before we move forward is, where does the board see TRPA participating in evacuation planning? Where do you see us playing a role in that?
I think TRPA should be the convener. I mean, we've done a very good job of convening groups of people, I think evacuation plans, I understand that Washoe County has an evacuation plan. I think the local jurisdictions are in the best position to develop those evacuation plans because they're most familiar with their neighborhoods and points of, the exit points and the access points. I really think that we need to approach this from a regional perspective, but only as a convener to facilitate the conversation. That would be my recommendation. And the other thing that we could do that we haven't done, I'm probably going to be slammed for this, but when projects are approved, I think they need to consider how they're going to evacuate the homes of the residents or the homes that they're creating for residents. In other words, that's one small component, one small piece of the puzzle. But if they think about, they, for example, meet and confer with the local fire department, to come to some sort of understanding as to how that structure or that, complex of buildings would be evacuated in the event of an emergency, then you have multiple parties participating in developing a more integrated plan. And I think that we need to have that discussion as we approve projects.
Yeah, and I would add to that it seems like, the information that's been collected to date regarding emergency evacuation and, how difficult it is for some community members that don't have vehicles, that TRPA leading on that. And of course, we're not going to be the solution to it, but I think the problem has been identified, and to work with the local jurisdictions on how to implement programs that would be at the ready to assist with those issues, so that we know where those populations are, that there's a system in place to properly evacuate those members that don't have vehicles.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Bass. I completely agree that being the convener, we have every agency really possible that we need at the table currently. And, I can say that on August 3rd, before the Caldor fire, we had a presentation about our city's evacuation plan 2 weeks before. And our council, one of the things we really noticed was that we didn't have interagency, that wasn't part of our plan. And so we instructed our police chief and fire chief to begin working with Douglas County. And literally that week they began talking, and then the next week we were being literally evacuated and evacuating our whole city. And if you talk to our police chief or fire chief, they will tell you how critical it was that they began that communication. I think that should happen, a few times a year, that meeting should convene, and TRPA seems to be, we're already all here, so we should be able to do that, no problem.
Hey, thank you, everybody, for all of your really valuable feedback. I think we are wrapping up the workshop session, so we're going to convene maybe in a couple minutes, come back, debrief, and then we'll wrap up this item.
All right, for everybody on Zoom, we're just going to give it one more minute for all those in person to come back. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for indulging us in our transportation equity workshop. Hopefully that staved off our food coma from that delicious lunch with Steve. So again, for the record, Victoria Ortiz with TRPA, and I'm going to just give a couple minutes of review on the feedback that I heard from all of you in the engagement portion of our draft policy ideas. So on a high level, I heard ample support for translation services, particularly live translation at public meetings. There's a lot of support for community academies and trying to find ways to add diverse voices to the board. And there was a lot of feedback there of maybe even trying to encourage some corporate sponsorship for employers in the region to try to support some of those leaders that are already here in the community to engage. We also had a great discussion on compensation or incentives to participate. And we should clarify here the idea of whether it's stipends or reimbursement. We want to make sure that we're not paying people to vote, that type of engagement. We want to make sure that there's compensation in the sense of childcare that was brought up as a very important barrier from being able to participate in public meetings. So there's a lot of incentives that we can look into there. There was also a really great point that there's a larger percentage of target populations that might be using transit services and some of these other services. So let's make sure that when we're targeting a percentage of outreach efforts, we're including staff on how that recommendation comes forward and recognizing that these populations might take more resources in order to reach them. Let's see. And generally, I would say there was a lot of support for removing some contracting barriers. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Kira.
Okay, my sections were services and environment. We talked a lot about transit, sidewalk clearing, and evacuation scenarios. So for transit, we heard a lot of support for strengthening public-private partnerships in providing better transit, especially to the valley. in Reno for commuters and people getting to healthcare and shopping services. In regards to sidewalk clearing, I think there were some mixed opinions, but I think where TRPA could play a role is by providing mapping support and route support to our local jurisdictions when they are clearing sidewalks and bike paths. And then moving into environment, we talked quite a bit about evacuation planning scenarios, and I think there was a lot of mixed opinions about TRPA's involvement, but I think in general, all of the board members agree that TRPA should play a role in some form in a regional evacuation scenario. So I think we could discuss what that role could be in the future.
Okay, then I am wrapping up with access, infrastructure, and technology. In terms of access, again, we also talked a bit about snow removal, but also about having better access to information on the transit shelters, which would be real-time bus routes, things like that, where people know what the status is. And there seemed to be a lot of support about that. Motion sensor lighting to ensure that there was a safe environment, that maybe solar powered lights that would go on and off when people that are there at the shelter itself. In general, we wanted to make sure that things were ADA compliant, but there was not a desire, let's say, to reinvent existing trails, but more so to make sure that we've got the right modes associated with the right paths on a basin-wide effort. In terms of infrastructure, I don't think I heard anyone not support the idea of really making broadband a priority, and it's already moving forward in TRPA. So this is something that the board has already set policy on at this point. And we also had a lot of support for intelligent transportation systems, and that kind of segues over a bit into technology. The idea that you could tie together light signals and making it easier for people to get in and out of areas, changing the way that we actually control movement through the basin, making that better. Also coordinating with Caltrans and local jurisdictions to tie those all in together so that even though they may go across different jurisdictions, the technology could work across all those different paths. And then I want to finally go back a little bit to infrastructure, talking about using opportunities to have multilingual signage and flashing messaging, that sort of thing would let people know things about availability of parking, any type of information they might need in terms of evacuation or health, and again, services in general. Also, I think everyone was generally supportive of the Equity Index scorecard, with the understanding that that is a reference document to guide a review of potential project, program, or initiative, but not a specific grade list that you have to hit a certain target for each and everything that we went through. But overall, I thought it went really well, very fast.
Yeah, and I will give the report out from our members of the public who participated via Mentimeter while you all were having your discussions. So to circle back to engagement policy, members of the public encouraged building trusted relationships with members of the community, meeting people where they are, engaging with already trusted community leaders. As well as a lot of support for adding diverse voices to decision-making bodies, city councils, this board, TTD, et cetera, and increasing the frequency of outreach to underserved populations. For the access, infrastructure, and technology policy ideas, increasing or developing communication plans that identifies how people can access transit, making dedicated HOV lanes perhaps, and park and ride options so that people can get to the public transit options as well as gondola access. And then a couple points brought up for the services and environment policy ideas. Mass and micro transit specifically to assist the workforce in getting to the basin to come to work. And identifying where there are gaps in evacuation services. increasing those services, but also identifying gaps and where those services don't serve the community. And that was it.
Thanks, Catherine. I just have one slide after this and then this will wrap up this item. So I just wanted to say thank you for participating in this workshop. Your feedback has been really valuable, and we will take the feedback that we heard from you today and from the community, and we'll be developing a list of draft policies with our consultants. We are hoping to bring that back to you in early summer for your endorsement, and then we'll be taking that list of draft policies or that list of policies and incorporating it into our transportation plan updates over the next couple of years. So that's all I have today. Definitely check out our website, explore that My Sidewalk platform, and thank you again for participating.
Great. Well, thank you. We really appreciated the facilitation, and Kendall and Victoria and Kira. Thank you for walking us through all of that. Board members, any other comments or questions? We've had quite a bit of time to converse on these. Yes.
I just wanted to say great work on your community outreach. My constituents also have spoken to me about all these issues, so I feel like you've hit a lot of great points. So thank you very much for doing that work.
Thanks, Alexis. Any of our board members online, would you like to conclude with any comments or questions? Okay, then we'll turn it over to and ask for public comment now on this item. Are there any members of the public that are here in the room that would like to address the governing board? Go ahead and come up to the microphone. And then those of you online, if you can raise your hand on the Zoom screen or hit *9 on your phone and you'll be unmuted. So we'll start here in the room.
Hello. Hello, my name is Scott Robbins. I'm a member of the South Lake Tahoe City Council, but I want to preface that my comments are mine alone and not representative of the council as a whole or of the city of South Lake Tahoe as a whole. I thought a lot of what I saw here today was very interesting. It showed a lot of vision and a lot of understanding of the places we need to go in the future. But I have to bring it back to the present. And at this time, we are not moving forward. The reality of our public transit system is that we're moving backwards. Bus service, only this just past November, here in the South Shore, was cut in half. And we're not making a connection here between the housing crisis and the inability to hire drivers. This was mentioned at one of the breakout sessions, is that even on the North Shore, you're experiencing a severe shortage of commercial drivers. And there is a connection between the housing crisis, and there's a deeper connection between the fact that the rare residential unit permits are allowed to be used for full-time commercial vacation rentals, which has driven up the cost of housing, because housing comes off the rental market and goes into the tourist accommodation unit market. That drives up the cost of housing. Housing becomes unavailable. The cost and labor leaves the region. The cost of that labor goes up, and we're no longer able to hire drivers. Heavenly Ski Resort here in the South Shore pays their commercial drivers for their buses close to $30 an hour, and they have bus service every 15 minutes. If that's not in the budget for the various transit agencies, then you have to address the problem at the level of the costs of living. And so long as we're not addressing in a meaningful way the fact that a huge proportion of our housing supply has been diverted for tourist accommodation uses, then we're not going to be able to get a handle on the cost of living, which means we're not going to be able to get a handle on the labor shortage, which means we're not going to be able to execute on these visions for a grand integrated transit system, which requires things like park and ride, which requires bus infrastructure, all of which requires staff, and staff that can be hired at affordable rates. So I'm sorry, but there's a disconnect here between the vision for the future, which is fantastic, but the present reality in which we're operating, and the underlying causes of the staffing shortages that are not just limited to government operations, but to all businesses here in the basin area. Everyone's short of staffing because no one can afford to live here. And unless we get a handle on these underlying problems, we're not going to be able to execute on the vision for the future. And it's a vision which I love. I really like where we're going, where we're talking about what we think we can do. But we have to address the present shortcomings. And we have to deal with the fact that we are currently going backwards, not forwards. And if we want to go forwards, we got to get the car out of reverse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robbins. Yes, sir, go ahead and come up. Anyone else in the room after this gentleman? Okay.
Brett Tibbetts, K-Rock. I would like to echo completely the last, the council members' comments. I am completely befuddled by the planning and then what you actually do as the TRPA. How in the world, when you're talking about transportation equity and limiting trips, does it make sense to move Barton Hospital from state line from the Y to state line? It can primarily serve South Lake Tahoe. There's 25,000 people there? And you're going to bring all those people up here for healthcare? The 2,000 people that live on the Douglas County side, we mostly use Carson Tahoe Hospital, not Barton. It just seems totally back-asswards that you would allow that to happen. Evacuation planning, I was amazed that you act like there's nothing you do. All of your effort is into limiting roadway capacity right now. You want to limit Highway 50 on the east side. You want to limit the North Shore. That's restricting evacuation. I don't understand it. You've got a complete mess on the North Shore with the traffic calming traffic circles and that emergency vehicles cannot use, snow plows can't use, miles of traffic, people can't get to their jobs. Living, people, all the big projects you approved lately are for rich people. There's no affordable housing. Go back to Barton Hospital. That site could have been an amazing site for affordable housing. One of the few left. And yet there's no public discussion. It's just all behind the black curtain. It's amazing. The Tahoe Beach Club, the Latitude 39, absolutely no effort to include affordable housing, none. So people of reasonable means can't live here. Everything you do is that I see is moving toward making this the billionaire boys club with all the private beaches, all the billionaires that live here. I don't see what you're doing. The words are fine, but I don't think your actions and what you actually approve back up your words. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't see any others in the room signaling. So are there any hands raised online?
Yes, Madam Chair, there are a few hands raised online. Ted Peterson, if you unmute, you can address the board. Ted Peterson, if you can unmute your microphone, you can address the board.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Ted Peterson. Thank you for my time today here. I'm a resident to our own home over on Sacramento Avenue, and I'm contacting you regarding the Homewood Mountain Resort project. And I wanted to call in to reference my appreciation on behalf of TRPA. I've been actively following the project and felt that
Mr.
my voice.
Peterson?
Hello?
Mr. Peterson, if I could interrupt, this is an item on transportation equity. We will have time under general public comment for your comment.
All right, thank you.
So we'll call on you in just a few minutes.
All right, thanks very much.
Okay. Are there any others in the public that are interested in the transportation equity workshop that we just spoke about?
Doug Flaherty, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thank you, members of the committee. This is directly related. Shelley Aldine brought up the issue of where TRPA should take a role in convening transportation evacuation. By state compact and states that an environmental threshold carrying capacity means an environmental standard necessary to maintain a significant scenic, recreational, educational, scientific, or natural value of the region, or to maintain public health and safety within the region. The information you currently have in your standards only addresses public facilities. So you are totally deficient. You're aware of the issue. You're required to come up with a public safety threshold environmental threshold carrying capacity, and you're not doing it. And you've avoided this for a very long time. Yes, you are the conveners. In fact, you're required under the compact that says there's a public interest in protecting, preserving, enhancing the values for the residents of the region and the visitors of the region, which include public health. So I want to mention, you guys, what your role is. Develop a public safety environmental threshold carrying capacity, which includes the elephant in the room, wildfire evacuation for the public, for the residents and the visitors, and basically understand the difference between an evacuation plan, which is nothing more than a bunch of arrows on a map, and an evacuation roadway capacity assessment. They're two different things. You must provide a data-driven public roadway evacuation assessment capability study. The Butte County Grand Jury did this many years ago. Their board of commissioners at that time rejected their suggestions, and a few years later, Paradise burnt down and we lost many lives. So I think it's time for the board to say, look, until we do this assessment, this wildfire evacuation road capacity assessment, we're going to put on hold all this stuff about increased height, density, and coverage. It's just craziness. It's time to get serious about this. And additionally, we need an updated supplemental EIS from the 2012 regional plan, taking into account all the changes and changing conditions in the Tahoe Basin since 2012. Thank you so much.
Whoops, thank you, Mr. Flaherty. Are there others?
Yes, Madam Chair, Kathy Julian, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the workshop. On this, I'd like to follow up on what Doug was saying, Doug Flaherty, in terms of I fully support his suggestion for the focus on roadway capacity study. And I appreciate one of your members who mentioned that when you look at developments in the region, and especially housing developments or tourism developments, that one should look at the impact that that would have on evacuation plans. And in particular, I would say, in agreement with the previous speaker, roadway capacity, because in northern, in Incline Village, Crystal Bay area, this is the critical factor. And I also thank you all for being so supportive of bilingual translation and those services to our Spanish-speaking community. That's greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, there are no other hands raised to comment on this item.
Thank you. So we'll close the public comment. And are there any further comments from board members? I'm not seeing any in the room. Anybody online from our board? I'm not seeing hands raised. So we'll finish this item. Thank you for the great workshop. We appreciate it. And hopefully we'll look forward to seeing some policy suggestions coming back to us. With that, we'll move on to item 7 on our agenda. This is our reports item, and I'm going to pass it over to Julie Reagan for the Executive Director's status report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Julie Reagan, TRPA Executive Director. First of all, thank you all for your attention. We know that it is snowing out, so we're going to move through these last couple of items. We do have an RPIC meeting, and we have, for those of you who need to be on that committee, we're going to shorten that presentation. So I just wanted to give you a little housekeeping report there. I have a few items to share. First of all, in your packet, for those of you online, page 207 is a PDF of our annual report. For those of you here in the room, it's around the dais. There also is in your packet on page 259, the Tahoe and Brief report, which previews some of the items to come, which can shorten my report. But I'm holding up the timeline. This report documents 2022, and it was a 10-year milestone of our regional plan update. And so I wanted to turn your attention particularly to the timeline that shows some of the progress that not just TRPA has achieved, but really the whole entire partnership of Team Tahoe, as we like to call it, because we do nothing alone here in the basin. For example, on the cover of the annual report is the Dennis Machita Trail of the Conservancy and El Dorado County and all the many partners that created that beautiful broken link in the trail network on the South Shore. And as we talk about the challenges as we have today, it's easy to get daunted. There are so many challenges ahead, but it's equally important to note what we have accomplished in the last decade as a partnership with TRPA in its leadership role of the compact. So I really want to thank all of you for the work that you have taken over the years or in recent years. I want to thank our staff for pulling that report together, research and analysis, the communications team. We've had a lot of hard work to deliver that. So want to note that as well. We mentioned in greater detail in our operations committee this morning, a report on our budgets. We're in budget season, as many of you are aware. So I will just truncate that for the benefit of the full board. In Nevada, we had our first legislative informational hearing last week before last, and we are working with the governor's office and with the legislature with some pretty exciting opportunities in Nevada to come up to our 1/3 share of the compact appropriation request. We also have some requests to pass through to the Tahoe Transportation District in our budget request. So I really want to thank many of our board meetings, in particular, Member Hill, Member Settlemeyer, and others that have been helping us move through the Nevada process. And it is a biennium, so we are in session this year, and this is a 2-year budget for Nevada. And so we're optimistic that we'll move that through to a successful conclusion in early June. And in California, we are working very hard to maintain our baseline funding. We are not in the general fund in California, which is facing a very substantial shortfall, $20+ billion. In the state, our funding on the general fund side for TRPA's general fund comes from California through special funds, the Environmental License Plate Fund and the Harbors and Watercraft Fund, which supports our watercraft education program and the invasive species program. And so we're working hard to keep those at baseline. And we'll know more when the governor's budget in California comes out in May, the revision of that budget. But we're engaged very heavily with our California Natural Resources Agency and also our legislative partners in California. So more to come there. We'll keep you posted. I also wanted to note that TRPA did send a comment letter. It was a very brief 1-page comment letter related to the Palisades Tahoe project, which of course is out of the basin, but there is a revised project going through an environmental process right now with Placer County. And so I wanted to make sure that you all knew that we submitted a comment letter, basically saying that we're working together to collaborate on solutions around transportation, mitigation, and any potential impacts to the basin. And any of you that are interested in learning more about that can give me a call. I can send you the letter if you're interested. Next month, Lake Tahoe Community College has a project coming before you on student housing. And many of you heard a briefing from Jeff DeFranco and the team at the Lake Tahoe Community College last year. It's a 100-unit student dorm project here in South Lake Tahoe. Very exciting, related to housing as a potential solution to relieve some pressure on housing on the South Shore. And for those of you who are newer to the board, if you would like to know more in advance of that meeting, also let me know. The college team has volunteered March 14th for a site walk of any board members that didn't have the benefit of that briefing last year. Just let me know if anyone is interested to go over for a field tour. There's snow on the ground. It's a little hard to see, but just being on the campus, at least you might get a sense in person of what that potential project could mean for the college and for the community and for the lake. And so that will be a decision coming to you next month. We have a climate code workshop coming up. I wanted to share with you, you heard from Jacob Stock and Devin Middlebrook from our staff last year during the briefings of our initiatives that we are working on an update to our code of ordinances related to climate. And so our long-range planning staff are working with graduate students from UC Davis Environmental Policy and Management program to develop this first phase of work. And the board, any interested board members who want to participate in that on Thursday, March 2nd in the afternoon, you're welcome to do so to contribute your ideas. And Jacob Stock from our long-range planning staff is coordinating that, but also reach out to myself or Maria if you want more information. Importantly, we have some pretty exciting news to share related to staffing. Last week, we interviewed stellar candidates for a Chief Partnerships Officer and Deputy Director position. And this was basically my former position at TRPA. And I want to thank our interview panel, HR Director Angela, John Hester, Nick Haven, and our Tahoe Conservancy partner, Jason Vasquez, who served on this interview panel. And we are pleased to report that our very own Kim Chevalier, who I think is in the office. There she is, big wave. You all know Kim. Come on up, Kim. Come on. Just wanted to introduce, you all know Kim. She brings valuable mediation skills, plenty of relationships in and out of the basin and experience to this role. So really, if you want to just say a quick word, Kim, Kim's joining our executive team.
Thank you, Julie. I'll be very brief. I'm really very excited for the opportunity and really looking forward to working with all of you in the future. So just thank you.
Yep. Great. You'll be seeing more of Kim, and we'll be backfilling Kim's position. So we're posting that for the EIP division manager. We also had a new employee, Mariana Gavrick, start this month. She will be our new finance and grants analyst, backfilling Melissa Uppendall's position, who left the agency. We have a new employee at the front desk, which is a temporary employee, and her name is Michelle. So please say hello to you when you're visiting. And also we have a new GIS specialist that's starting, Andy McClary, and he's working remotely for a couple months trying to find housing here in the basin, moving back to the West Coast from Vermont, returning home to the West. And he brings a wealth of knowledge in GIS and will really help, I think, a lot of these discussions around housing and transportation to visualize more what we're talking about. So I appreciate your indulgence for that report. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Julie, and congratulations, Kim. Appreciate the opportunity to continue to promote here. Then I guess we pass it to John Marshall.
Thank you. Just from the outset, we're going to continue the mini lecture on the open meeting law, given the time of day and the additional committee meeting that we're going to have. But it's also because of our discussion at legal committee regarding teleconferencing, which we will talk about in just a second when we have a report from the legal committee. But I just want to report that another lawsuit was filed against the agency last Friday, challenging the ski run cell tower that is the subject of the Eisenstecken litigation. This litigation concerns the plan revision that the governing board heard an appeal on that related to the increase in foundational excavation for the tower. So that will be represented by our outside counsel and indemnified by Verizon for defending that plan revision permit. And that's it.
Thank you, John. And so board members, do you have any questions of either Julie or John on any of these items? I know Haley does, so I'll start there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that report. I just wanted to turn briefly to the regional plan performance measures report as part of your report, Director Reagan, page 223. And this we can talk more about this as we go through. But just looking at some notes on this, specifically, it looks like a few of our performance measures, specifically numbers 5 and 6, were not evaluated because we have new performance measures that we're going forth with. And I'm just wondering,
the process of changing those because they came out of the regional plan. How we update those, just so we know what the performance metrics are, and then sort of to follow up on that. I love the met, partially met, not met, so we can keep ourselves honest and accountable. And I'm just wondering though, if, in future meetings, again, just lack of time today, but in future meetings, if we can talk a little bit more of those 8 that are not being met or reported on, and what we're doing in those categories. Again, this is food for thought for other conversations, but I'd like to start it today at least.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I may, Julie Reagan, I'll jump in on that. Thank you, Vice Chair. I should have noted that report in my earlier discussion, and I want to rewind a bit. Got a little echo there to the regional plan update process. The board adopted these performance measures, and we will be discussing this at our retreat in April, because over time, we've seen improvements that need to be made to those performance measures. And there's lots of examples noted in this report, but it was really to satisfy a lot of concerns about the direction of the regional plan. And we wanted to notate, how are we progressing in some of these big policy ideas, a lot of the discussion that we had today, and how does that translate on the ground? So in particular, the transportation measures, we have a new way of looking. Feedback there. Let's see, testing. Which one? Let's see. Can folks hear me? I'm really sorry. I want to invite. Yeah, we'll get to come out with the audio problem. We will answer your question and we'll cover this in the meeting. Julie, is mine still doing that too? Okay. We'll take a quick pause for IT AV support.
Okay, sorry for the delay. Looks like we're back up. Julie, if you want to finish your answer.
That's much better.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, IT. Again, Julie Reagan, TRPA Executive Director. So to go back to where we were, we will discuss this at the retreat. I think your question speaks to even a larger discussion around our threshold update initiative and overall where we have a lack of data. How do we work through that? We find this throughout the whole entire system, and that's why we're working through a results chain process to really change the whole framework of measuring what matters. It's part of our initiative. So we are looking at that, but I'm going to invite Hester to add to some of the specifics related to transportation.
We have, excuse me, we have the threshold update, the Measuring What Matters initiative. But in addition to the thresholds, some of which are out of date and not really relevant, and some of them didn't have a baseline against which you could measure. We have about 400 other things we're measuring, including these regional plan performance measures. And some of them are very similar to things we're measuring for other, and some of them are hard to get data on. So really, that's why we had that initiative to go through if you count the thresholds, 500 plus things we're measuring. that we really should get down to about 100. And so that's why you're seeing things like that in there. And you'll see that. I know you're not in the threshold update stakeholder working group, Ashley is, but you'll see Dan Segan talking about, well, this says we're going to reduce it from the 2002 level or something like that by this much. Everybody says, what's the 2002 level? Well, nobody knows. So we've got a lot of stuff like that we're trying to clean up. Hope that answers your question, but it's one of the initiatives we definitely will be recommending as staff that we keep working on moving forward.
Thank you for that. Happy to hear we're talking about it in the retreat. I think I'm just hoping that, yes, having baselines to measure off of is important, and that as we keep a scorecard, if we're changing metrics, it's public, we know what we're changing, we know what we started from, and we know what the goal is, so we can measure appropriately. And I think having things that are similar, but we could combine, might make it easier to streamline for everyone. So I appreciate that. I look forward to the continued conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Other board members' comments or questions on our executive director's report or legal counsel report? I'm not seeing any here, and I'm not seeing any hands raised. Okay, then we'll move on to item 8. And this is governing board member reports. Are there any governing board members wishing to give a report? Again,
I'm
not
sorry,
much interest here in the
this is,
room, but
Commissioner Bass, I was muted, I guess. I was just real quickly back to the district report there. I very much agree. When I went through the performance metrics, I think it's great and relates to kind of land use policy and the things that are really important to affect the change, but it doesn't show us where we're at. And even the very simple data, even as simple as the 10-inch white plate and where is our clarity on that baseline, but along with the data that we have from cell phones and are we meeting any DMT reductions and things that I think are pretty accessible for us. Hearing that there's a 500 that we need to simplify to 100, that seems like a lot of work. And I would just think that we could get some of these more simple data points to start from that would be included in these performance reviews.
thank you, Mr. Bass. Any other board members with comments or board member reports?
A lot of the things that you are asking about and that Cody was asking about are online. They're on LT Info, like we do report the clarity and all those sort of things. They're
Yeah.
just not, some of them are not in this regional plan performance measures report.
Well, I look forward to that discussion as well. I saw some gaps where we're not making those that obviously that we want to focus on. Okay, I didn't hear any other board member reports. Going once, going twice, we'll go to committee reports. So first, anything from local government and housing? I don't think they've met. Legal committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to turn this over briefly to John Marshall. We did have a good discussion at legal committee about open meeting law requirements and some ideas going forward.
Thank you. To be pretty brief, what we talked about was our teleconferencing policy. As you all know, we are moving out in both states from the emergency declarations for the originally put in place for COVID that allowed significantly more latitude in holding public meetings via teleconferencing and remote participation by board members. Kind of cutting to the chase, we have a current rule of procedure 2.16, which guides teleconferencing for TRPA. It is similar, but a bit different from the California Brown Act, which applies to TRPA like other local jurisdictions. But it differs in a number of potentially meaningful ways. And what we're going to be doing next is bringing back some, I think, some general discussion points for how we might amend our existing rules of procedure to take advantage of, and may also need to tighten down a bit on some of our practices under Rule of Procedure 2.16. But this is all because starting next month, we'll have to be consistent with Rules of Procedure 2.16 until we amend it. And it has significantly tighter restrictions than we are currently operating for teleconferencing. So when we kind of bring that package back, then I'll also present generally on the open meeting law to kind of as a tutorial. So that's kind of where we are. I don't know if you want to get into the details or not about the specifics of particular policies, but we're trying to get as much flexibility to promote a number of the policies that are in the Brown Act and the Nevada open meeting law, at the same time allowing the public to participate remotely.
Thank you. And you hit it, but I just want to emphasize that we're not talking about changing remote participation for public. We're talking about board member teleconferencing. So people know that there's no limit that we're considering.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And that's it from legal. Okay, operations and governance. Shelley, are you still on? And would you like to update on anything else?
Nothing further.
Okay, transportation and public outreach. And Forest
Are you
Health and
there?
Well-
No.
Yes.
So, on the EITPO committee, we did have elections for chair and vice chair. We heard two informational items, one on the Tahoe Transportation District activities, and secondly on Vision Zero strategies and safety plan updates. And we did defer the third item for our next meeting, which is a briefing on transportation performance and recommendations report framework. And that's it.
Thanks, Belinda. And then Bud is left on Forest Health and Wildfire, and RPIC is yet to meet. So we will have a report at next meeting on RPIC. So this is our opportunity. This is our final public comment period. We're now finishing our meeting, but if there's any member of the public wishing to address the governing board on any item listed or not listed on the agenda, including items on the consent calendar, you may do so at this time. And individuals who have already commented on items listed on the agenda are not permitted to comment again on the same topic. The governing board is prohibited by law from taking immediate action or discussing issues raised by the public during this public comment period. We'll hear comments on any single topic, but not on the agenda for up to and not to exceed 30 minutes. So hopefully we won't get there today. If you wish to speak to the board and you haven't spoken to us on an item yet, please raise your hand and come to the podium, or raise your hand on Zoom and you will be called on unmuted. Anyone here to speak to us on an item on the public comment? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just the green button. I'm Dana Tibbetts from Cave Rock, and I thought there would be some discussion today about the Highway 50 safety project on the East Lake Corridor. Obviously, that is not part of the conversation, but I do want to just address the fact that this is one of those issues where the rubber meets the road, and we who live on that side of the lake are stakeholders in that and have very serious concerns about how that project is proceeding, about whether there's been adequate hearing of residents and their positions on this. And with respect to the discussion and concern about evacuation, I actually don't even know how this project can be on the table to, strip out 2 lanes of that highway, especially when we saw the not only the gridlock here in town around the evacuation during Caldor, but what happened all the way out to Glenbrook and beyond. It was a parking lot for practically 24 hours. Very, very dangerous situation. So I'll come back to this with my comments when it's a more appropriate time and there's context for discussing it. I think there's a lot of ideology that's getting in the way of actual safety. And I find that terrifying. And I really would hope that this body would undertake serious consideration of, putting an end to this proposed replacement of traffic lanes with bike lanes. And it just doesn't make sense. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we have a number of individuals online. I think Mr. Peterson was first, and then we'll go from there, Catherine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ted Peterson, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thank you. Take two. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to extend my appreciation today on behalf of the TRPA agency and the leadership of Julie Reagan, with staff, Paul Nielsen and Jeff Cowan. I'm calling in here on the Homewood Mountain Resort matter. In the letter that was sent out on February 4th to JMA Art Chapman, I really appreciate the TRPA giving this outline and taking it forward and addressing the important issues that surround this project. The West Shore feels a betrayal is in place with the bait and switch of this project, the privatization, architecture, and the importance of the process being followed. And I think TRPA is doing the right thing and representing the master plan. And there's reference that TRPA needs to find the project is consistent with the approved 2011 master plan. And so thank you very much for carrying this matter forward. Thank you for my time today.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.
Next hand up is Laura Patton. Laura, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Board. My name is Laura Patton, and I'm speaking on behalf of the League to Save Lake Tahoe. Our comment is related to the regional plan update, which was referenced in the executive report. Thank you, Vice Chair Williamson, for the comment, and to TRPA for the response, which is really the subject of our comment today. As you know, the League was really heavily involved in the 2012 regional plan update by state working group. And just like you, we're heavily invested in its successful implementation. We appreciate the opportunity to continue to work with TRPA and the local jurisdictions to really implement the RPU. The RPU included benchmarks in the report, and they were a key negotiation point for the League in 2012. The goal of these was really to ensure that the massive risks that we were taking in overhauling the regional plan had trigger points and safeguards. The benchmarks, like thresholds, were a way to see if the plan was reaching its goals and to do something about it if it wasn't. While the annual report is really well done and highlights the many successes over 2022 and the first 10 years of the RPU, we see a disconnect between it and the performance measures report. According to the 2022 RPU measures, of the 14 measures, 8 are largely not being met or not reported on. 10 years after adoption, it's helpful to look at these benchmarks just to kind of get a sense of what the goals really were back then for the plan. It seems like to date, a lot of these have been forgotten. So we're really hoping for more discussion about the performance measures report, specifically how the development projects and area plan amendments in the pipeline, including Palisades, will affect performance measures, especially measures that transfer development from sensitive land to town centers, affordable housing, BMP certificates, and scenic measures. We'd also like to confirm if TRPA is allowed to change performance measures, as number 5 and 6 were not measured in 2022, because TRPA is proposing replacing them with new transportation metrics. We don't think TRPA can or should change or replace these performance measures. They're supposed to measure the long-term effects of the RPU, and VMT is still valid. The VMT threshold advisory group conversations have not addressed replacing or changing the RPU performance measures. We can understand that the regional plan is not meeting measures because there's so many factors influencing it, but this can't just be an exercise to check the box. There needs to be a strategy to update the plan to meet these measures, and we hope to continue working with you guys to make sure that those measures are considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Patton.
Next hand raised is Doug Flaherty. Doug, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thank you, Chair, members of the board. TRPA continues to fill its own mission statement as the Lake Tahoe Basin free falls out of harmony and equilibrium and degrades before our eyes. Despite the glowing progress report, we see it differently. By the way, speaking on behalf of TahoeCleanAir.org, the TRPA mission statement is the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency leads the cooperative effort to preserve, restore, and enhance the unique environmental and human environment of the Lake Tahoe region. It is self-evident that TRPA's current policies and project approvals have caused Lake Tahoe Basin to become out of equilibrium and harmony as the TRPA and its governing partners increasingly create opportunities for more growth, more building height, more density and coverage, more human and traffic density, more vehicle miles traveled, more out of control neighborhood and regional adverse impacts, more algae, invasive weed and species growth, more degradation of our streams, more microplastics in the lake, and decreased lake clarity, which unbelievably you didn't even talk about in your 2022 report. Traditionally, TRPA's mindset of more is exponentially contributing to what is already widely recognized as a dire public safety peril. And of course, without repeating that totally, we're talking about inadequate wildfire evacuation. I hope you guys look at your business model. It's not working. You can put together as many glowing reports as you'd like, very colorful. A lot of work went into it, and that's, you know, that's great. But we're in an environmental free fall. We may be actually at the point of no return. And basically what we're getting is a lot of direction from the board and the staff to work on issues other than purely environmental. And it's simply not working. So I hope that each and every one of the board members remember that you're stewards of Lake Tahoe, and your job isn't just to rubber stamp what the staff asks you to do, is to protect Lake Tahoe. We're at a critical point. So which one of you are going to step up and provide the leadership to protect this lake and its clarity? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flaherty.
Next hand raised is Rhonda Teiser. Rhonda, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thank you. I'm Rhonda Teiser from Incline Village. When I learned that TRPA housing staff members were using the 2021 Tahoe Prosperity Housing Study to help guide their current housing policy decisions, I made a public statement in the Incline Community Forum that I didn't think the data of that housing study justified the author's conclusions. Heidi Hill Drum of the Prosperity Center asked me to explain my statement. I've now managed to critique the entire 190-page study. I'll distribute this critique to Heidi and to Karen Fink and other housing decision makers at TRPA. Today, I have just a few minutes, so I'll only address one of the study's most glaring issues. The survey was distributed to Incline and Crystal Bay residents and targeted people who were employed in the community. Most respondents lived in Incline, but about 25% commuted to work. The housing study included multiple choice items, as well as write-in responses. I have many issues with the study conclusions, but the most serious omission was the complete lack of an analysis of the hundreds of write-in responses. This seemed like a huge oversight. When I read the comments, I realized why they were stuck in the appendix without analysis. Because when respondents were given an opportunity to suggest strategies to solve Incline's employee housing problems, of the 226 write-in responses, 93 or 41% of respondents said to limit or eliminate short-term rentals. Only 55 or 24% of respondents said to create more affordable housing. So far and away, when given the opportunity to say what they thought was most needed, Incline employees said limits were needed on short-term rentals. The study authors reported that 175 respondents were likely forced out of their homes because of owners converted to short-term rentals. And to their credit, the authors wrote 2 paragraphs suggesting Washoe County should restrict short-term rentals. But for the past 4+ years, Washoe County has fought inclined citizens tooth and nail, refusing to put a cap on any real limits on our more than 700 permitted short-term rentals, half of which are in missing middle condominiums. That's our real employee housing problem right there in a nutshell. Thanks to the Prosperity Center for collecting the data.
Thank you, Ms. Ticer.
The next hand raise is Teresa McNamara. Teresa, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Hi, Madam Chairman and governing board members. I am speaking today about my concerns regarding the Homewood Mountain Resort Ski Area Master Plan and the precedent this project may have for future development around the Lake Tahoe Basin and specifically in the Homewood area. My concern is that the recent updates to the project do not seem to be consistent with TRPA code ordinances, their plan area statements, and the ski area master plan approved by the TRPA governing board in 2011. Great effort went into the preparation, community acceptance, and TRPA approval of those documents. And as a full-time Homewood community resident, I want to make sure that all development at Homewood Mountain Ski Resort adheres to the 2011 approved ski area master plan. There was a letter directed to the TRPA by Arthur Chapman, and this was the first time information regarding the proposed changes to the project had been outlined at length and were released to the general public, not just to a limited number of HOA members. I specifically live in the HOA directly next door to the Homewood ski area, and our HOA or myself, none of us were contacted about their changes. The proposed changes outlined in that letter have come under local public scrutiny, as these changes do not appear to adhere to the development conceptual renderings the community agreed to and TRPA approved in 2011. I am requesting that the governing board address the public with a detailed explanation of how the changes fit within the vision and goals of TRPA area plan and the Alpine Village architectural style of the old Tahoe lodges presented in the 2011 plan. A similar request was outlined and made in the recent letter to JMA Ventures President Arthur Chapman from the TRPA Special Project Manager, Paul Nielsen. I am thankful for Paul's letter. I am also requesting that TRPA receive answers to all of Mr. Nielsen's questions prior to allowing any further progress on the development, including giving direction to Placer County's building department, planning department, and desire review committees to not issue or approve any permits or permit any changes or modifications for development that do not adhere to the TRPA area plan approved in 2011. Implementation of the originally approved 2011 TRPA master plan will revitalize a beloved local ski area and deliver substantial environmental benefits to the Tahoe Basin. However, the changes being proposed by Mr. Chapman will not provide any of the approved 2011 master plan or promised community enhancements and will in fact have a negative impact on the community. As a longtime local Homewood resident, I am relying on the TRPA governing board to ensure that the originally proposed and approved design and scope of the 2011 plan is the only development that will be allowed, because that is what the community agreed to. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. McNamara. Next.
Kathleen Anise, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Hello, I appreciate the opportunity to share my concern regarding the Homewood Mountain Resort Ski Area Master Plan and the precedent this project will set for future development throughout the Lake Tahoe Basin. I would like to bring to the governing board's attention that JMA Ventures, the parent company of Homewood Village Resorts, have stated they are not pursuing their original plan. The loophole for developers to present one thing to the public and have a very different thing be permitted by governing agencies should be addressed immediately by Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and Placer County government. I'd also like to thank TRPA Executive Director Julie Reagan, and TRPA Special Projects Manager Paul Nielsen for attempting to do so in the recent letter to JMA Ventures President Arthur Chapman. Thank you again. My concerns rest in the recent updates to the project, which do not appear to be consistent with the Homewood Mountain Resort Ski Area Master Plan approved by the TRPA Governing Board in 2011. With respect to the planned area statements and environmental threshold carrying capacities for this project, the proposed changes do not comply with the Environmental Impact Report, Environmental Impact Statement previously certified for the Homewood Mountain Resort Ski Area Master Plan. With regard to the newly proposed architectural design changes as found in Phase 1C and Phase 1B, these changes do not conform to the TRPA Plan Area Statements and Placer County Plan Area Statements under the adopted West Shore Area General Plan Standards and Guidelines. My concerns have been further outlined in greater detail with a written letter to the Governing Board. However, I would like to bring forward the request to you now to please address the public with a detailed explanation of how the changes do or do not fit within the approved plan. Until clarification is received, I would also request TRPA to advise Placer County's Building Department, Planning Department, and Design Review Committee to not approve or issue any permits, permit changes, or modifications to development that will not adhere to the approved 2011 Homewood Mountain Resort Ski Area Master Plan and the TRPA West Shore General Area Plan Standards and Guidelines. Great effort went into the preparation and community acceptance, TRPA approval of those documents. And as a patron, season pass holder of Homewood Mountain Resort, past resident of Homewood for 20 years, and current North Lake Tahoe homeowner, I would like to make sure that all development at Homewood Mountain Resort adheres to this master plan. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have 3 or 4 more public comments. I'm going to ask if you are calling in under public comment on Homewood, if you could just say if you agree with the previous comments on Homewood and try to shorten your comments, because we've lost a number of members of our governing board and we still have an RPIC meeting and it's snowing. Thank you.
Next hand up is Dan Copenhagen. Dan, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, thanks to the board for your ongoing and in-depth work attempting to address all the various challenges in the Lake Tahoe Basin. I know there are many. And I'm speaking on behalf of my extended family and various homeowners in Rubicon Bay and along the West Shore, including Tahoma and Chambers Landing, Homewood. And I will keep this short and sweet because I concur with both Teresa and Kathleen and all of their comments. They outlined it well, but I just wanted to reiterate the comment that the master plan was specifically outlined and approved as a community enhancement program. And it clearly states that throughout the plan. The objectives were clearly stated along those lines, and that has obviously changed. So appreciate the efforts by TRPA, and we would request that the developer, JMA, not only submit a new master plan, but also an update to the environmental impact report before proceeding with any further construction. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Copenhagen. I appreciate you abbreviating your comments. Next.
Ann Nichols, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello? Oh, yeah, thanks.
Yes, we can hear
Ann
you.
Nichols, thanks. North Tahoe Preservation Alliance. You know, this is kind of maybe some lightness. Mona Lisa doesn't need a hair extension. Lake Tahoe is beautiful. We don't need more large development to make things better. It really hasn't worked. It was the basis of the 2012 regional plan that large development was going to fix everything. It hasn't worked. It won't work. We need to throw that in the rubbish bin of more bad ideas. What we need is a commitment to less, a commitment to figuring out capacity. What's going on now is not doing the environment any favor. And you say you have a development cap, so don't worry, we can't get any more. The poster child of why this is wrong is Boulder Bay. It was 110,000 square feet. The new proposal with less units is 800,000 square feet. You know, factor of 8, and they are claiming less traffic. It's just, this is why we're starting to not believe, but we do know that North Shore is becoming uninhabitable with traffic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Next.
Next hand up is Judith Miller. Judith, if you unmute, you can address the board.
Thank you for the opportunity. I do agree with some of the prior speakers about our failure to achieve the mission of TRPA to protect the natural and human environment. I also agree with the council person from South Lake Tahoe, I believe it was Mr. Williams, who lamented about our inability to provide affordable housing for our workforce. We see media reports of over-tourism, workforce housing shortages, and traffic backups. And according to the UC Davis State of the Lake report, despite TRPA's responsibility and actions, Lake Tahoe has been impacted, particularly in areas linked to greater numbers of people. Yet TRPA seems poised to extend a California tactic to address workforce housing by allowing 2 additional dwelling units on residential parcels in these rural communities. With the push for tourism, these are more likely to become even more short-term rentals, not workforce housing. It's estimated that 12% of the dwelling units in my community of Incline Village, that's 1,000 out of the 8,000 here, are now STRs. Nearly 75% of these STRs are condos, and they used to provide the bulk of housing for our service industry employees. We need to have some balance. TRPA could come up with some kind of a solution to achieve that balance, yet they don't seem to be even considering it. It would be great to see our neighborhoods and schools filled once again with full-time residents. Another measure that appears about to be approved will increase the height, density, and allowable coverage in Tahoe town centers. Together, these 2 major changes will bring even greater numbers of people to the basin, severely impacting the lake clarity, our already crowded roadways. And you talked earlier today about evacuation plans. It'll endanger lives and hamper those evacuation routes. Please do address these critical issues, improve roads and transit before making such drastic revisions, and please give consideration to a basin-wide regulation on short-term rentals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller.
And Madam Chair, that was the last hand raised.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So we'll close the public comment period, and I would ask, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And we're going to move now to the RPIC committee. It's going to meet in this room and on this platform, and we'll start in 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes.
Good day all.
ARPIC.